The Mississippi Delta in the years after the Civil War was a place where the war had technically ended but authority had not shifted in any meaningful way. Federal law said slavery was over. Local reality said something else. Land was still owned by the same families. Courts were still run by the same men. Violence no longer needed chains to function. It had learned to wear paperwork, uniforms, and silence. Welcome to the liturgy of slavery. I'm sure today's story, a story about slavery, will touch your heart. So relax, be quiet for a moment, and listen carefully. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what city you're listening from. Your participation helps preserve these stories. Let's get started. The land dictated everything. Cotton fields stretched for miles, worked by men and women who were no longer legally owned but were still trapped by debt, contracts they could not read, and the constant threat of arrest. Sharecropping replaced slavery on paper, but the economic math never worked in favor of the laborer. A bad season, a dishonest ledger, or a single accusation could end a life just as efficiently as a whip once had. The courthouse in the county seat stood on slightly higher ground, both physically and symbolically. Its brick walls were new, rebuilt after the war, and represented what local officials called order. Inside, records were kept, disputes were settled, and names were fixed in ink. Outside, people understood that the law did not protect everyone equally. It decided who mattered. Reputation in the Delta was currency. A family name could open doors, stop investigations, or erase inconvenient facts. Men who carried the right surnames moved freely between plantation houses, courtrooms, and political meetings. Those without names or with the wrong ones were expected to stay quiet. The man known locally as Elias Carter did not fit cleanly into any category. He worked on land that had once belonged to a prominent Mississippi family before the war and had since been divided and reorganized under new legal arrangements. On paper, Elias was a hired laborer with a seasonal contract. In practice, he was watched more closely than others. Not because he caused trouble, but because he didn't behave the way someone in his position was expected to. He kept his back straight when spoken to. He asked questions when wages were calculated. He could read posted notices without asking for help. When disputes broke out among workers, he avoided them, not out of fear, but calculation. People noticed these things. Elias lived in a small wooden structure near the edge of the property, separate from the larger quarters where most laborers stayed. The arrangement had been made years earlier, supposedly for convenience. In reality, it isolated him. It also allowed him privacy. At night, he read old newspapers, legal notices, and discarded account books he salvaged from town. He did not speak about where he learned these skills. No one asked directly, but rumors circulated quietly. His appearance raised fewer questions than his habits. His skin tone placed him in an ambiguous position in a region obsessed with racial classification. He was not white, that much was clear, but he was lighter than most of the workers, and older men sometimes stared at him longer than necessary, as if trying to place a memory. The Delta was full of people with incomplete pasts. That alone was not dangerous. What made Elias dangerous to the system was that he was trying to complete his. Small signs of his upbringing surfaced in fragments. He had been taught to write with discipline, his letters careful and consistent. He knew how to handle documents, how to recognize forged signatures, how to follow legal language even when it was deliberately vague. These skills did not come from the fields. They came from a childhood lived partially indoors, partially hidden. His mother had died years earlier. Officially, she was listed as a domestic worker who had passed from illness. No father was named. Elias remembered her as cautious to the point of fear. She avoided towns when possible, refused to answer questions about his birth, and insisted he never repeat certain names he overheard in his youth. When he pressed her, she would shut down completely. Silence was her defense. By the time she died, Elias understood that her secrecy was not random. It was protective. The labor overseer, a man named Harlan Reed, tolerated Elias but did not trust him. Reed had survived the war by aligning himself with whoever held power at the moment. He was careful, observant, and loyal to the landowners who paid him. He reported irregular behavior when it suited him. Elias knew this and kept his distance. Other workers treated Elias cautiously as well. Some respected him for his intelligence. Others feared that association with him could bring unwanted attention. In the Delta, attention was rarely harmless. The county judge, Samuel Whitaker, was known as a stabilizing figure. He had served before the war, survived Reconstruction politics, and now presided over property disputes, labor contracts, and criminal cases with an air of measured authority. Publicly, he was fair. Privately, he was deeply invested in preserving the social order that benefited men like him. Judge Whitaker believed in records. He believed that what was written defined reality. He also understood which records should never exist. Elias did not encounter the judge directly at first. Their connection began indirectly through paper. One afternoon, Elias was sent into town to deliver a ledger related to crop yields. While waiting near the courthouse, he noticed a stack of discarded documents placed beside a clerk's desk, intended for disposal. Most people ignored such things. Elias did not. He recognized formatting used in older legal filings. He waited until the clerk stepped away, then glanced through the top pages. One document caught his attention immediately. It referenced a property dispute from decades earlier involving an estate division after the death of a prominent landowner. Several heirs were listed. One name had been crossed out and replaced with an annotation indicating claim invalidated due to illegitimacy. The surname matched the family whose land Elias now worked on. The date aligned roughly with the year of his birth. The first name attached to the invalidated claim was his mother's. Elias did not take the document. That would have been noticed. He memorized what he could, folded the ledger, and left town without reacting. But the moment stayed with him. It was not proof, but it was confirmation that his mother had not been lying. Something had been taken from her. Something had been erased. That night, Elias did not sleep. He replayed conversations from his childhood, moments when his mother had stopped speaking mid-sentence, the way she reacted whenever certain family names were mentioned. Fear, not shame, had shaped her silence. Over the following days, Elias became more careful and more focused. He adjusted his routines, limited conversations, and began quietly asking indirect questions in town. He framed them as curiosity about old land disputes, inheritance laws, and Reconstruction-era rulings. Some people brushed him off. Others answered cautiously. One elderly clerk told him, without context, that some names were never meant to be carried forward. Another warned him that digging into old estates only brings trouble. The overseer noticed the change. Elias was quieter, more alert. He worked efficiently but watched the road more often. Reed mentioned it to one of the landowners, who dismissed it at first. Then a rumor surfaced, vague but persistent, that someone was asking about family records that had been settled long ago. The rumor reached the courthouse. Judge Whitaker did not panic. He had handled similar situations before. Most claims died quickly once pressure was applied. What concerned him was not the claim itself, but the man behind it. Someone with limited resources asking the right questions was more dangerous than a wealthy heir demanding recognition openly. Whitaker instructed a clerk to review recent inquiries. Elias's name appeared more than once. The judge did not summon him. That would escalate things unnecessarily. Instead, subtle measures were taken. Elias's labor contract was reviewed. His accounts were scrutinized. A minor discrepancy in reported wages was flagged. Nothing serious, just enough to justify attention. Elias felt the shift immediately. His pay was delayed. Reed questioned him aggressively about his time in town. A deputy passed by his dwelling one evening and lingered longer than necessary. The system had noticed him. Despite the pressure, Elias did not stop. He adjusted his approach. He focused on identifying witnesses rather than documents, people old enough to remember his mother, her presence in the household she had worked for, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. One man, a former stable hand now living on the edge of town, recognized Elias on sight. He said nothing at first. When Elias pressed gently, the man warned him to leave the past alone. "You're walking into something bigger than you," he said. They buried that story on purpose. The warning did not stop Elias. Clarified the stakes. By the end of the month, the rumor had solidified into something more specific. People whispered that Elias believed himself connected to a powerful family. Some laughed. Others grew uncomfortable. In the Delta, claims of bloodline challenged the entire structure of authority. Judge Whitaker reviewed the original estate file personally. He confirmed what Elias had seen. A claim erased, a name removed, a problem resolved quietly. The judge understood that if this claim resurfaced publicly, it would not only disrupt property arrangements but invite federal scrutiny, something local officials wanted to avoid at all costs. The judge decided the situation required containment. Elias was called in, not to court but to the sheriff's office, under the pretense of clarifying his employment status. The conversation was polite, controlled, and threatening in its calmness. Elias was reminded of his position, his lack of documentation, and the consequences of making unfounded claims. He was released without charges. The message was clear. That night, Elias stood outside his dwelling, looking across land that may have once been tied to his name, though never publicly acknowledged. He understood now that the truth existed, but only as long as it remained hidden. The moment it surfaced, it became a threat. The conflict had begun, not with violence but with recognition. And recognition in the Mississippi Delta was dangerous. The warning Elias received at the sheriff's office did not end the matter. It formalized it. From that moment on, his existence was no longer peripheral. He had crossed an invisible boundary, not by breaking the law, but by approaching the truth too closely. In the Mississippi Delta, this distinction meant nothing. What mattered was disruption, and Elias had become disruptive. The days following the summons were marked by subtle but consistent changes. His labor assignments shifted without explanation. Tasks that once rotated among workers were now assigned to him repeatedly, designed to exhaust rather than employ. His access to town was restricted under the justification of increased workload. When he questioned discrepancies in his pay, the overseer responded with irritation rather than indifference. The system was not punishing him openly yet, but it was closing in. Elias responded by becoming more controlled, not less. He understood escalation when he saw it. His upbringing, fragmented as it was, had trained him to recognize pressure before it became force. He adjusted his routines again, limiting his movements and choosing his interactions carefully. He stopped asking questions in public spaces and began listening instead. Information in the Delta traveled in fragments, through pauses in conversation, through what people refused to say. Elias learned to read those absences. What became clear was that Judge Whitaker had not dismissed the rumor. He had acknowledged it as a threat. The judge's reputation rested on stability. Stability, in turn, depended on the idea that the past was settled. Any claim that suggested otherwise, especially one involving inheritance, could unravel carefully maintained arrangements. Elias's existence challenged not only property lines but legitimacy itself. Whitaker did not act impulsively. He never had. Instead, he allowed the system to apply pressure incrementally. A deputy was assigned to patrol near the fields more frequently. The sheriff's office requested updated records from landowners, including employment histories. Clerks began reviewing old files not to expose the truth, but to identify weaknesses. Elias's lack of formal documentation became the focal point. The message was consistent. Without papers, you had no standing. Without standing, you had no voice. Elias understood this logic. He also understood that documentation had once existed and had been deliberately removed. That knowledge changed his calculation. The question was no longer whether the truth was dangerous, but whether silence guaranteed survival. The pressure suggested otherwise. Even without public accusation, he was being targeted. His restraint had not protected him. At this point, Elias faced his first real moral and strategic decision. He could leave the region entirely, disappear into another county where no one knew his name, and live out his life as an anonymous laborer. Many had done exactly that. Or he could continue, knowing that each step forward increased the likelihood of irreversible consequences. He chose to continue. The decision was not dramatic. It was quiet, made one evening as he reviewed the few items his mother had left behind. A folded piece of cloth with initials stitched into it, a name never spoken aloud, and a memory of her telling him that some truths only mattered if someone survived to carry them. Elias believed that survival without identity was another form of erasure. He began seeking people, not records. Documents could be destroyed or altered. Memory was harder to control, especially among those already marginalized by the system. He identified 3 individuals who might know something: an elderly woman who had worked in the household connected to the disputed estate, a former clerk rumored to have copied documents unofficially, and a man who had once transported goods between plantations and had seen more than he admitted. Each interaction carried risk. Elias approached cautiously, never stating his claim outright. He framed his questions as historical curiosity, as an attempt to understand the past. Some conversations ended quickly. Fear closed mouths faster than threats ever could. One encounter, however, went differently. The elderly woman recognized Elias immediately. She did not need prompting. She stared at him for a long time before speaking, as if measuring the cost of acknowledgement. When she finally spoke, it was not confirmation, but warning. She told him his mother had been protected for as long as possible, hidden within the household until her presence became inconvenient. She hinted at pressure from family members who feared complications. She did not say Elias's father's name, but she did not deny it either. The woman told him something else that mattered more. She said Judge Whitaker had been involved even then, not as a judge but as a legal advisor. He had helped settle the matter discreetly. Elias realized that the judge was not just an obstacle. He was part of the original erasure. This information reframed everything. What Elias was facing was not a single corrupt official, but a continuity of power. Whitaker represented the legal memory of the system. As long as he remained in control of records and proceedings, Elias's claim would never be recognized, regardless of its validity. The system did not simply deny justice. Curated history. Pressure intensified as Elias's movements were noticed. Someone reported seeing him speaking with the elderly woman. Another mentioned his presence near the old clerk's residence. These observations made their way back to the courthouse. Whitaker did not confront Elias directly. Instead, he accelerated containment. A formal complaint was filed against Elias alleging breach of contract and insubordination. The charges were minor but strategic. They justified surveillance. They allowed deputies to question people he interacted with. They isolated him socially, as association now carried legal risk. Some workers distanced themselves immediately. Others offered quiet support but refused to be seen with him. One man, younger and more impulsive, warned Elias bluntly that people were being asked questions and that names were being written down. Another advised him to stop before someone got hurt. Elias weighed these warnings carefully. He knew that others were now at risk because of him. This realization marked a shift in his thinking. The conflict was no longer solely about his identity. It had expanded, implicating anyone who helped him. The system was doing what it did best, turning survival into a collective liability. Judge Whitaker, meanwhile, began preparing a more decisive response. He reviewed the legal framework available to him. Vagrancy laws, fraud statutes, contract violations, tools designed to criminalize inconvenience. He did not need to prove Elias wrong. He only needed to neutralize him. Elias sensed the narrowing window. He began consolidating what he knew, committing details to memory in case written evidence was destroyed. He considered confronting Whitaker directly but dismissed the idea. The judge controlled the environment of confrontation. Any public appeal would be dismissed or turned against him. At the same time, Elias began to imagine alternatives that he had previously avoided. The idea that the system could be reasoned with was fading. What remained was the reality that power protected itself through elimination, not dialogue. The question was how far Elias was willing to go. The breaking point came when a man who had spoken to Elias, a former clerk, was arrested on unrelated charges and held overnight without explanation. No evidence connected Elias directly, but the message was unmistakable. Cooperation had consequences. That night, Elias did not sleep. He understood that the pressure would not stop. It would escalate until he was either silenced, imprisoned, or forced to flee. Each option carried loss. Fleeing meant abandoning the truth entirely. Imprisonment meant erasure under another name. Silence meant accepting the legitimacy of the lie. For the first time, Elias considered the possibility that justice, as defined by the law, was unreachable. If the law itself had been used to erase him, then appealing to it was meaningless. The system demanded obedience, not truth. This realization did not lead immediately to violence. It led to clarity. Elias began observing Judge Whitaker not as an authority figure, but as a man. He noted his routines, his patterns, the times when he was isolated. This was not yet a plan. It was assessment. Understanding that Whitaker was human, and therefore vulnerable, shifted the balance of power psychologically, if not practically. By the end of this phase, the conflict had become impossible to ignore. Elias was no longer simply reacting to pressure. He was preparing for a choice that would define everything that followed. The first irreversible steps had been taken, not in action but in intent. The system had forced the question. And Elias knew that whatever answer he chose, there would be no return to anonymity. The consequences of Elias's persistence arrived not as a single event, but as a tightening sequence of losses. The system did not strike immediately. It constricted. Within a week of the former clerk's arrest, Elias's labor contract was terminated without explanation. The landowner cited restructuring and unpaid discrepancies that Elias had no opportunity to dispute. His dwelling was reclaimed as property of the estate. By nightfall, he had no official place to sleep, no legal employment, and no protection. This was not punishment in the legal sense. It was administrative removal. Elias understood what this meant. He had not been charged, which would have given him a chance, however limited, to respond. Instead, he had been made irrelevant on paper. Without work, without residence, without records, he became vulnerable to vagrancy laws that required no proof beyond presence. The law did not need to chase him. It only needed him to exist. He stayed with a worker's family on the edge of the fields for 2 nights, fully aware that this placed them at risk. On the 3rd night, he left voluntarily. The pressure he was under had begun to spread outward, and Elias refused to let others pay the cost of his decisions. This choice isolated him completely, but it was deliberate. From that moment on, he acted alone. Judge Whitaker was informed of Elias's displacement and approved the next phase without issuing explicit instructions. That was how he operated. Orders were implied, never written. Deputies increased patrols along the roads leading out of the county, stopping men who fit Elias's description and questioning them about their purpose. No arrest was made yet. The objective was containment, not resolution. Elias moved cautiously, sleeping in abandoned structures, traveling at irregular hours, avoiding predictable routes. Hunger became constant, but it sharpened rather than weakened him. The pressure stripped away hesitation. What remained was focus. During this period, Elias returned to the information he had gathered and reassessed it not as a claimant seeking justice, but as a man confronting a closed system. The truth existed, but it was irrelevant without power. Witnesses could be intimidated. Documents could be erased. Memory could be discredited. Only one element remained constant: Judge Whitaker's control over legitimacy. This understanding reframed the conflict entirely. Elias no longer viewed the judge as an obstacle to be overcome legally. He saw him as the final mechanism by which the lie was maintained. As long as Whitaker lived and held authority, the erasure would continue not only for Elias, but for anyone else whose existence complicated the narrative of order. The shift was psychological but profound. Elias stopped thinking in terms of appeal and began thinking in terms of outcome. Meanwhile, the system escalated. The elderly woman Elias had spoken to was questioned aggressively. Her employer was warned. She was reminded of debts, obligations, and past indiscretions. She did not recant, but she stopped speaking entirely. The former clerk remained under suspicion, released but unemployable. The message was clear. Association with Elias resulted in social and economic death. Elias learned of this indirectly and recognized the pattern. This was not about him alone anymore. The system was enforcing a boundary, making an example. That realization hardened his resolve. If the cost of truth was collective suffering, then partial measures were no longer defensible. He began observing Judge Whitaker's movements more deliberately. Whitaker lived modestly by local standards, a reflection of his belief in restraint as a form of authority. He walked to the courthouse most mornings, declined unnecessary escort, and maintained predictable routines. He believed in the legitimacy of his position and the protection it afforded him. This belief made him careless. Elias did not approach immediately. He watched from a distance, noting timing, routes, and moments of isolation. He was careful not to be seen repeatedly in the same locations. This was not impulsive behavior. It was methodical. Each observation reinforced the same conclusion. The judge did not believe himself to be personally at risk. At the same time, Elias wrestled with the moral implications of what he was considering. He did not frame the decision as revenge. He framed it as consequence. The judge had not simply denied him recognition. He had actively destroyed lives to preserve a lie. Elias questioned whether removing such a man constituted murder or intervention. The distinction mattered to him, even if the law would never recognize it. The internal conflict intensified as Elias weighed alternatives. Escape remained possible, but only at the cost of abandoning not just his claim, but the people already harmed. Silence would validate the system's tactics. Exposure without power would result in further retaliation. Violence emerged not as a desire, but as a remaining option. The final catalyst came when Elias was formally accused of vagrancy. The charge was posted publicly. It authorized deputies to detain him on site. This transformed the situation from pressure to imminent capture. Once detained, Elias would lose all agency. He would be processed, imprisoned, and likely transferred or leased out under convict labor arrangements. The system had closed the loop. With this development, the timeline compressed. Elias understood that delay increased the likelihood of capture without achieving anything. The choice he had been preparing for was now unavoidable. He made his decision without ceremony. Elias secured what he needed quietly. He avoided theft when possible, but survival dictated compromise. He selected a moment when Judge Whitaker would be alone, returning from an inspection of county records stored outside town. The location was familiar, the road narrow, bordered by trees that limited visibility. The choice of setting was practical, not symbolic. In the days leading up to the confrontation, Elias experienced a clarity that surprised him. Fear did not disappear, but it no longer dominated. He understood the risk fully and accepted it. This acceptance marked the point of no return. Even if he did not act, he would never again be the man he had been before the first document surfaced. The night before the planned encounter, Elias revisited the memory of his mother one final time. He recalled her insistence on caution, her belief that survival required silence. He did not see his decision as a rejection of her lesson, but as an adaptation. The world she had navigated no longer existed. The system had evolved, but its purpose remained unchanged. On the morning of the confrontation, Elias positioned himself early and waited. Time stretched, but his focus did not waver. When Judge Whitaker appeared, alone as expected, Elias observed him briefly, not as an authority figure, but as a man whose choices had shaped countless unseen lives. What happened next would not be accidental. It would not be justified by impulse. It would be the result of accumulated pressure, deliberate erasure, and a system that had eliminated every alternative. The escalation was complete. The climax was imminent. The morning of the confrontation began like many others in the Delta. Humid, quiet, and outwardly ordinary. That surface normalcy was precisely what allowed the system to function. Violence here rarely announced itself. It arrived embedded in routine, disguised as procedure, justified by habit. Elias understood this, and he relied on it. Predictability was the system's greatest strength, and in this case, its weakness. Judge Samuel Whitaker left his residence shortly after sunrise, carrying a small leather portfolio that contained notes from a recent inspection of county land records stored in a private annex outside town. He walked alone, as he often did, declining an escort he considered unnecessary. His authority, he believed, was not fragile. It was structural. Men like him did not expect consequences that took physical form. They trusted in law, reputation, and the distance those things created between decision and outcome. Elias had been in position for nearly an hour. He did not rush. He did not pace. He watched the road, the surrounding fields, the edges of visibility where movement might signal interruption. His preparations had not been elaborate, but they were sufficient. He had planned for a narrow window, a confined space, and the likelihood that no one would intervene quickly. This was not courage. It was calculation shaped by necessity. When Whitaker appeared, Elias felt no surge of emotion. The man approaching him was not an abstract symbol of injustice. He was not a villain framed by ideology. He was simply the person who had made deliberate choices, repeatedly knowing exactly who would suffer as a result. Elias waited until Whitaker was close enough that retreat would be awkward and sudden movement would draw attention. He stepped into view. Whitaker recognized him almost immediately. The recognition was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. His posture stiffened slightly, and his expression shifted from neutral to guarded. He did not raise his voice. He did not call for help. He understood in that moment that this encounter was not accidental. Elias spoke first, addressing him formally using the title Whitaker valued. The choice was intentional. It framed what followed not as an ambush, but as a confrontation. He referenced the estate dispute, the invalidated claim, and his mother's name. He did not accuse. He stated facts. He described the erasure calmly, in detail, demonstrating knowledge that could not be dismissed as rumor. Whitaker listened without interruption. When Elias finished, the judge responded with practiced composure. He did not deny involvement. He contextualized it. He spoke of the times of necessity, of avoiding greater unrest. He framed the decision as administrative, not personal. According to Whitaker, the claim had been resolved in the interest of order. Elias's mother had been compensated quietly. The matter, in the judge's view, was closed. Elias pressed further, asking directly whether recognition had ever been possible. Whitaker's response was measured and final. He stated that legitimacy was not determined by truth alone, but by stability. Granting Elias recognition would have destabilized property arrangements, social hierarchy, and legal precedent. The cost, in Whitaker's assessment, outweighed the claim. Therefore, recognition had never been an option. This admission clarified everything. Whitaker did not see himself as unjust. He saw himself as necessary. He believed that some truths were too disruptive to be acknowledged, regardless of their accuracy. In his framework, Elias's existence was not a wrong to be corrected, but a problem to be managed. Elias asked one final question. If the truth were undeniable, if witnesses spoke and documents resurfaced, would Whitaker act differently now? The judge's answer was immediate. No. He stated plainly that even now, recognition would serve no purpose. The past was settled. Reopening it would invite chaos. Elias, he said, should accept what was possible and abandon what was not. That statement marked the end of the conversation. What followed was not chaotic. It was brief and contained. Elias acted with the awareness that there would be no justification, no explanation that would matter. The act itself was direct, without spectacle. Whitaker did not have time to call out. When it was over, the judge lay still, and the authority he represented ceased to exist in that place. Elias stood for several seconds afterward, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. He understood fully that nothing could undo what he had done. There would be no return to negotiation, no restoration of anonymity. The system would respond, and it would respond decisively. He left the scene immediately, moving away from the road and into terrain that limited pursuit. Within an hour, Whitaker's absence was noticed. By midday, his body was found. News spread rapidly, first as shock, then as speculation. A judge had been killed. This was not an everyday occurrence. It represented a direct challenge to authority, and the response was swift. The county entered a state of controlled panic. Deputies were mobilized. Roadblocks were established. Questioning intensified. Anyone known to have interacted with Elias was interrogated. The murder was framed not as an isolated act, but as an assault on order itself. Language mattered. This framing justified extraordinary measures. Elias was named a suspect quickly. His prior disputes, his lack of fixed residence, and his recent accusations made him an ideal target. The narrative assembled around him with efficiency. He was described as unstable, delusional, and dangerous. His claim of lineage was recast as obsession. This was not an investigation seeking truth. It was containment seeking resolution. As the search expanded, the effects rippled outward. The elderly woman who had spoken to Elias was taken in for questioning and released hours later visibly shaken. The former clerk disappeared from town entirely. Workers avoided one another, understanding that association could be interpreted as complicity. Silence became a survival strategy. Elias moved carefully, but the landscape was hostile. Patrols covered main routes. Informants were incentivized. The system did not need to catch him immediately. It needed to demonstrate reach. Each checkpoint, each interrogation reinforced the same message. Resistance would be erased. Despite the intensity of the response, something unexpected occurred beneath the surface. The judge's death disrupted more than procedure. It disrupted certainty. Whitaker had been a stabilizing presence, a known quantity. Without him, decisions stalled. Records went unsigned. Disputes lingered unresolved. The system revealed its dependence on individuals, not just structures. Rumors began to circulate, not about Elias's guilt, which was widely assumed, but about the reason behind the act. Whispers of erased claims and buried records surfaced quietly. They did not gain official traction, but they altered perception. For the first time, some people considered the possibility that the judge's authority had not been neutral. The immediate consequences, however, were severe. A reward was posted. Posses formed. Elias was wounded during one encounter, narrowly escaping capture. The injury slowed him, increased risk, and forced him to seek shelter in places that compromised his isolation. Eventually, the pressure became unsustainable. Whether through betrayal, exhaustion, or miscalculation, Elias was captured. The details of his arrest were not recorded clearly. Counts differed. What mattered was that he was taken alive and brought under control. The confrontation had ended, but the conflict had not resolved. The system now faced a problem it could not fully suppress. A murder that exposed its own history of erasure. Elias's fate would be decided next, but the consequences of his action had already begun to settle into the Delta's collective memory. The climax was complete. The cost was irreversible. The days following Judge Samuel Whitaker's death did not unfold as moments of chaos, but as a rapid reassertion of control. Shock was allowed to surface briefly, just long enough to justify force. After that, order returned, not because it had healed, but because it had been reinforced. The system did not grieve the judge as a man. It mobilized around him as a symbol. Elias was held in a county facility under conditions designed to isolate him completely. There was no public hearing, no immediate formal charge presented to an audience. His detention existed in a space where legal process blurred into administrative necessity. Officials understood that time itself was a weapon. The longer Elias remained unseen, unheard, and unrecorded in official proceedings, the easier it would be to define him entirely on their terms. News of the arrest spread unevenly. In white households and public offices, it was framed as the capture of a dangerous agitator who had murdered a respected judge. In the quarters and among laborers, the information traveled more cautiously. People spoke in fragments, in lowered voices, and always with the understanding that walls listened. Some believed Elias had acted out of desperation. Others feared that asking why would draw attention they could not survive. The official narrative solidified quickly. Elias was described as unstable, obsessed with imagined lineage, and motivated by resentment. His background was reconstructed selectively. A man without records, without property, without legitimate ties. The implication was clear. Someone like him could not be trusted to tell the truth about the past. His claim, therefore, did not require investigation. It required dismissal. The estate records were reviewed internally and declared complete. Clerks certified that no legitimate claim had been omitted. Any documents that suggested otherwise were deemed errors or misinterpretations. This administrative closure was presented as finality. The past once again was settled. Elias was questioned repeatedly. The interrogations were not designed to extract information. They were designed to produce consistency, specifically, a version of events that aligned with the official account. He was asked the same questions in different forms under different conditions at different times. Fatigue was intentional. The objective was not confession, but compliance. Elias did not recant his claim. He did not embellish it either. He repeated the same facts, the same sequence of events, and the same reasoning. His consistency became another tool used against him. It was framed as fixation rather than credibility. The system did not need him to lie. It needed him to be unbelievable. As weeks passed, interest from outside the county diminished. Reconstruction-era federal oversight existed on paper, but intervention required visibility and political will. The murder of a local judge by a man without status did not generate sympathy. It generated justification for local control. The case was quietly contained. The community absorbed the consequences unevenly. Those who had spoken to Elias withdrew into silence. The elderly woman who had confirmed aspects of his past stopped, leaving her employer's property altogether. The former clerk was rumored to have left the state, though no one could confirm it. Absence became the preferred survival strategy. Among laborers, Elias's name became something spoken only indirectly. He was referred to as that man or the one who asked questions. His story shifted depending on who told it. In some versions, he was reckless. In others, he was brave but foolish. What remained consistent was the understanding that he had crossed a boundary that was never meant to be tested. The landowners moved quickly to reinforce hierarchy. New rules were introduced regarding movement, gatherings, and employment verification. These measures were framed as preventative, necessary to maintain safety. In reality, they functioned as reminders. Authority had been challenged, and authority would respond decisively. Elias's legal fate unfolded with minimal transparency. A trial was discussed, postponed, and then restructured. The charge shifted from murder to a combination of offenses designed to ensure conviction regardless of evidence. The judge who would have presided was appointed from outside the immediate circle but shared the same priorities. Stability, not truth, remained the guiding principle. When Elias was finally presented in court, it was not as a claimant or a witness to history, but as an offender. His lineage was deemed irrelevant. His motivations were reduced to pathology. The court did not ask whether his claim was accurate. It asked whether he had committed an act that threatened order. The answer to that question was predetermined. The verdict was swift, the sentence severe. Whether Elias was executed, imprisoned indefinitely, or transferred into forced labor arrangements varied depending on the account. Official records were deliberately vague. What mattered was that he ceased to exist as a public figure. The system did not need to decide his fate clearly. It needed him gone. In the weeks that followed, Judge Whitaker was memorialized. His death was framed as a tragedy that underscored the dangers of disorder. His role in past estate decisions was never mentioned publicly. His legacy was curated carefully. He became a symbol of fairness destroyed by instability. Privately, however, something had shifted. The absence of Whitaker created practical complications. Disputes lingered. Decisions stalled. New officials struggled to replicate his control over records and relationships. The system adapted, but imperfectly. In these gaps, questions surfaced, not loudly, but persistently. People remembered fragments. A name crossed out. A woman removed from a household without explanation. A claim settled too cleanly. These memories did not coalesce into open challenge, but they unsettled certainty. The idea that the past was fixed became harder to maintain. Elias's story entered oral memory in distorted forms. Some said he was delusional. Others said he knew too much. In certain versions, his claim was exaggerated. In others, minimized. What united these tellings was the recognition that something real had been buried. The system's effort to erase Elias paradoxically ensured that he would be remembered, though never accurately. For the community most affected by his actions, the lesson was ambiguous. Elias had not freed anyone. He had not reclaimed property. He had not overturned the system, but he had exposed its limits. He demonstrated that legitimacy was not synonymous with justice. That realization carried weight, even if it could not be acted upon safely. The moral question Elias embodied did not resolve neatly. His act did not restore balance. It did not produce recognition. It resulted in loss, his life, his voice, and the further suppression of truth. Yet the alternative he had been offered was complete erasure. The system had demanded silence in exchange for survival. Elias had rejected that bargain. History recorded the event selectively. Official archives mentioned the murder without context. Property records remained unchanged. Legal summaries omitted the dispute entirely. Future generations reading those documents would find no trace of Elias's claim. The absence would appear natural, unremarkable. And yet, absence itself became evidence. In the Delta, people learned to read what was missing. They understood that not every silence was accidental. Elias's story became one of those silences, acknowledged indirectly, referenced obliquely, never confirmed. It survived not because it was preserved, but because it was suppressed. The legacy of the event was not transformation, but tension, a quiet awareness that justice, as administered, was contingent, that truth could be inconvenient, that law could be used not to reveal reality, but to manage it. For those who remembered Elias as a man rather than a case, the question remained unresolved. Had he been justified in his action? Did the pursuit of identity excuse violence? Or had the system engineered a situation where moral choices were reduced to impossible options? There was no consensus, only recognition that the system had offered no path to justice that did not require submission. Elias's life ended without public vindication. His claim was never acknowledged. His name did not appear in the lineage he believed was his. But his act disrupted the illusion that the past was settled. It revealed that history was not merely inherited, it was enforced. In the end, the story did not belong to Elias alone. It belonged to the structure that created him, erased him, and then relied on his erasure to preserve itself. The Delta moved on as it always had. Crops were planted. Contracts were signed. Courts resumed their work. But beneath that continuity lay a fracture. And that fracture posed a question that could not be archived away. If justice depends on silence, whose history survives? And at what cost? Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Who knows? The next story might be from your city.